December 1944. With Germany on the brink of collapse, Adolf Hitler ordered a massive offensive through the Ardennes forest. The goal: split the Allied forces, capture the crucial port of Antwerp, and turn the tide of the war. What followed was a brutal 6-week campaign known as the Battle of the Bulge, a fight that would test the limits of endurance and determination on both sides. By the winter of 1944, the situation for Germany was desperate. Allied forces were closing in from the west, while the Soviets advanced relentlessly from the east. In a bold and desperate move, Hitler ordered Operation Wacht am Rhein, a final offensive designed to split the Allied lines, encircle and destroy 4 Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace on the Western Front. However, many German generals had doubts about this plan. One was General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army. He recognized the severity of Germany's fuel, manpower, and ammunition shortages, yet continued with the operation as Hitler demanded victory. Despite these doubts, over 250,000 German troops, 1,800 tanks, and more than 2,000 artillery pieces were assembled. The plan relied on complete and total surprise and the capture of Allied fuel supplies to keep the German tanks moving. One of the greatest gambles was the hope that the Germans could seize the Allied fuel dumps, because without them, the offensive would stall. Before the German offensive began, the Allies had largely underestimated the importance of the Ardennes region. Believing that the dense forests and rugged terrain made a large-scale attack unlikely, the area was left lightly defended, with only inexperienced or battle-worn divisions holding the line. This in spite of the German success there in 1940. For weeks leading up to the offensive, some American soldiers stationed in the Ardennes reported hearing the sounds of vehicles and troop movements at night. These reports were dismissed by Allied intelligence, believing that the Germans were using recordings to create the illusion of a buildup. With confidence in their own growing strength and the belief that the German army was too depleted for a major offensive, the Allies were blindsided by what was about to unfold. Meanwhile, the Germans had been preparing in complete secrecy. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and thousands of tanks and artillery pieces had been built up near the Ardennes, with troop movements hidden under the cover of night. Every effort was made to deceive the Allies and keep the offensive a secret. As the attack began in the early hours of December 16th, Allied Supreme Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower was attending a wedding when the news reached him. The scale and suddenness of the attack took the Allies completely by surprise, forcing a rapid and urgent response. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, the German offensive began. The Germans had planned meticulously, relying on heavy fog and snow to ground Allied air forces. The first blows were struck by Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army in the north and Hasso von Manteufel's 5th Panzer Army in the center. Their goal: to smash through the American defenses and advance rapidly to the Meuse River. The Americans were caught completely by surprise. In the early days, the 106th Infantry Division was encircled near the Schnee Eifel, suffering the largest mass surrender of U.S. forces in Europe. Over 8,000 soldiers were taken prisoner. Leading the charge was Joachim Peiper, whose battle-hardened Kampfgruppe, equipped with Panther and Tiger tanks, carved a path through the American lines, capturing towns and leaving destruction in their wake. Peiper's men would soon gain infamy for the Malmedy massacre, where 84 American prisoners of war were executed. As the battle unfolded, the Germans sought to exploit the chaos with a bold plan: Operation Greif. This mission was led by SS Lieutenant Colonel Otto Skorzeny, who rose to fame after orchestrating the dramatic rescue of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini in the Gran Sasso raid of September 1943. For the operation, Skorzeny selected over 200 soldiers from various units, training them to speak English fluently, and equipping them with American uniforms and equipment. Their mission was to infiltrate American lines, capture key supply routes, and spread chaos among the Allied troops. As the German offensive began, Skorzeny's men moved through the confusion, hoping to sow disorder. Disguised as American soldiers, they aimed to capitalize on the chaos, exploiting any lapse in Allied coordination. However, the Americans quickly adapted, implementing clever tests to reveal imposters. Soldiers began asking questions that only Americans would likely know the answers to. They'd ask suspected infiltrators to name baseball teams, identify regional slang, or even answer, "Who is Donald Duck's girlfriend?" Questions that most Germans would struggle with. The psychological impact of these infiltrations ran deep. Rumors of enemy soldiers in disguise spread rapidly, eroding trust within American ranks. Troops became suspicious of each other, causing fear and hesitation, even among longtime comrades. In the end, however, the overall impact of Operation Greif on the German offensive was limited. Despite initial confusion and heightened anxiety among American forces, most of Skorzeny men were captured or exposed within days. The Americans' quick response neutralized much of the threat, and the operation ultimately failed to disrupt Allied communications or capture key supply lines on the scale intended. While the operation heightened tension and fear, it did not achieve the decisive breakthrough the Germans had hoped for. The failure to fully destabilize the Allied rear lines meant that in the end, Operation Greif had little strategic impact on the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge. Despite early German success, American forces quickly regrouped. In the southern sector, the crossroads town of Bastogne became a symbol of defiance. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe and his 101st Airborne Division were surrounded by German forces and ordered to surrender. His reply was short, but became legendary. To the German commander, nuts. The German command was taken aback by McAuliffe's reply. Initially, they were unsure of its meaning, with reports stating that some German officers thought it was an American slang term or an insult. They sent a request for clarification only to receive the same blunt response, nuts. For days, the Germans hammered the town, but the 101st held firm. Despite being low on supplies and outnumbered, they fought off every German assault. Meanwhile at Saint-Vith, American General Bruce Clark mounted a fierce defense. Although outgunned, the Americans delayed the advance of the 5th Panzer Army for 6 days, throwing the German plans into disarray. Despite initial gains, the German offensive was grinding to a halt. The key issue was fuel. German tanks were simply just advancing faster than their supply lines could handle, and their hopes of capturing Allied fuel depots had failed. The Germans had gambled everything on a rapid breakthrough, counting on capturing Allied fuel supplies along the way to keep their tanks moving. Kampfgruppe Piper had spearheaded the German attack. Their mission was to drive west toward the river Meuse, capturing bridges and fuel depots as they went. As they pushed deeper into the Ardennes, they met fierce resistance from the American units and were forced to take difficult detours. Roads were blocked, bridges destroyed, and American forces harassed the column at every opportunity. By the time Piper's unit reached La Glaise, a small village near the Amblève River, his unit had become isolated. Cut off from reinforcements and with fuel supplies almost completely depleted, Piper faced a critical decision. With no way to refuel his tanks and surrounded by Allied forces, Piper realized the situation was hopeless. On December 24th, he ordered his men to abandon their heavy equipment, including dozens of Tiger tanks and armored vehicles, and attempt to break out on foot. By December 23rd, the weather cleared and the full might of the Allied Air Force returned to the skies. P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons strafed German columns, destroying tanks, vehicles, and disrupting supply lines. The resumption of air superiority proved critical. Not only were the German supplies running low, but the Allies could now accurately target German forces, further delaying their advance and turning the tide of the battle. At the same time, American commanders were making plans to rescue the surrounded 101st Airborne in Bastogne. One of the most critical factors in the Allied victory was the rapid redeployment of General George S. Patton's Third Army, which had been fighting in Lorraine some 100 miles to the south. The key to success in this war is speed and audacity. I told Ike we could relieve Bastogne in 48 hours, and by God we did. On the 19th of December, Patton made a bold decision, ordering a massive, rapid 90-degree pivot of his Third Army towards the Ardennes. In brutal winter conditions, Patton's troops advanced over frozen, snow-covered terrain with little rest and under constant threat of German artillery and counterattacks. On December 26, 1944, the elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through the German lines and reached the besieged town of Bastogne, relieving the 101st Airborne after a week of bitter fighting. Although the siege was broken, the battle for Bastogne continued as the Germans made desperate attempts to take the town. However, with the arrival of reinforcements and clear skies allowing for constant air support, the German hope of capturing Bastogne had vanished. By late December, the momentum had fully shifted in favor of the Allies. With the failure to capture Bastogne, fuel shortages, and constant Allied air attacks, the German offensive began to falter. German commanders, realizing this, started to pull their forces back. In a desperate effort to regain air superiority, Hitler launched Operation Bodenplatte. On New Year's Day 1945, over 900 German aircraft took off in a surprise attack aimed at Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. The goal was to destroy as many planes on the ground as possible, crippling Allied air power in the region. Although the Germans managed to catch the Allies off guard, anti-aircraft crews quickly responded, creating a deadly hail of fire. Despite their initial success, many German planes were shot down by ground fire or intercepting Allied fighters. By the operation's end, the Luftwaffe had inflicted some damage, but suffered devastating losses, with over 200 aircraft destroyed and many experienced pilots killed or captured. And unlike the Allies, the Germans did not have a large surplus of planes and pilots available. Simultaneously, Hitler launched Operation Nordwind, the last major German offensive on the Western Front. The goal was to break through the American and French lines in Alsace, hoping to reclaim Strasbourg and divert Allied forces from the Ardennes. The initial German attacks quickly gained ground, but the Americans quickly regrouped, reinforced by additional troops and artillery. The terrain and harsh winter conditions took a toll on both sides, yet the German forces continued their assault. Despite small successes, Nordwind ultimately faltered in the face of resilient Allied defenses. By late January 1945, Germany's last Western Front offensive had failed. The initial shock of the Ardennes offensive had worn off, and the Allies quickly regained the upper hand. Germany's last reserves were depleted, and the battle had cost them dearly. Casualties mounted on both sides, with the Germans losing nearly 100,000 troops, along with 600 tanks and assault guns, and over 1,000 other vehicles. The Allies also faced heavy losses, suffering around 80,000 casualties, plus 800 tanks destroyed, and 1,000 aircraft lost. The Battle of the Bulge was a catastrophic loss for Germany. Their last major offensive in the West had failed, leaving the German army weakened and vulnerable to the coming Allied advance into the heart of the Reich. The Luftwaffe, once a formidable force, had been dealt a final blow, leaving them unable to challenge Allied air supremacy. The Allies, though victorious, paid a heavy price in lives. The battle was a stark reminder of the war's brutal toll, even in its final months. The Battle of the Bulge remains one of the most significant battles in American military history. It demonstrated the resilience of Allied forces in the face of a massive surprise attack, and marked the final desperate attempt by Nazi Germany to stave off defeat. Today, it is remembered as a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and determination to overcome even the most formidable challenges. To conclude, I'd like to share a couple of quotes. The first is from Bill Savage, a sergeant from the 75th Infantry Division, who said this to Joël Lamberty, a Belgian citizen who gives tours of the battlefield, specifically of the Northern Front and Bastogne. "It was hard, terrible, and I lost so many friends. But if it was needed, I will do it again to free you Belgian people." The second quote is from the memoir of Bruce Egger, a staff sergeant with G Company, 328th Regiment, 26th Division. He spoke for all GIs, but not just about the Battle of the Bulge. "More than 4 decades have passed since those terrible months when we endured the mud of Lorraine, the bitter cold of the Ardennes, the dank cellars of Saarlütern. We were miserable and cold and exhausted most of the time. We were all scared to death. But we were young and strong then, possessed of the marvelous resilience of youth, and for all the misery and fear and the hating every moment of it, the war was a great, if always terrifying adventure. Not a man among us would want to go through it again, but we are all proud of having been so severely tested and found adequate. The only regret is for those of our friends who never returned." Thank you for watching. Like, comment, hit subscribe, and be sure to share.